12 days after we buried our mother, I sat in a lawyer's office in Portland and listened to my brother explain in a calm and reasonable voice why the house I'd grown up in, the house our mother had lived in for 38 years, now belonged entirely to him. My name is Grace Bennett. I'm 36 years old and my brother Daniel is 39. Our mother, Eleanor Bennett, died of heart failure on a Tuesday morning in March, 18 months after a stroke had left her needing full-time care. I'd spent those 18 months driving 40 minutes each way, 3 or 4 times a week, to sit with her, manage her medications, and fight with 2 different insurance companies on her behalf. Daniel had visited, by my count, 11 times in that entire 18 months. So when the estate attorney, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Michaels, opened a folder and read aloud that the house on Larkspur Lane worth, by conservative estimate, around $410,000, along with the entirety of my mother's remaining investment accounts, had been left solely to Daniel, with a single sentence directed at me and to my daughter Grace. I leave my love and my gratitude for everything she did. I sat completely still, waiting for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't one. Daniel didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man trying very hard not to look pleased. I asked Arthur if there'd been some mistake. He told me the will had been signed and notarized 11 months earlier, and that everything about the document appeared to be in order. Daniel spoke up before I could ask anything else. He said gently, the way you'd explain something to a child, Grace, I know this is hard to hear, but Mom told me more than once near the end that she wanted me to have everything. She said you'd understand. She said it was because of the house, because I'd always talked about wanting to keep it in the family, keep it from being sold to strangers. I remember staring at him, trying to reconcile that sentence with the mother I'd spent 18 months caring for, a woman who, even in her hardest days, after the stroke had taken so much of her speech, would grip my hand every single visit and mouth the words sorry, over and over, for the burden she thought she'd become. I didn't believe him, not because I thought he was necessarily lying. I genuinely didn't know in that moment what to believe. But something about the timing, the certainty, the smoothness of his explanation sat wrong in my chest in a way I couldn't yet put into words. Quick question before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? I always love knowing who's here with me for these stories, and this one, I promise, gets a lot more complicated than a simple will reading. Because 6 weeks later, while going through a box of my mother's old journals that Daniel hadn't wanted, I found a handwritten note, folded twice, tucked into the back cover of a recipe book she'd kept since 1994. And what it said had nothing to do with wanting Daniel to have everything. To understand what that note meant, and why it mattered so much, you need to understand our mother, and you need to understand the shape of our family long before any of this began. Eleanor Bennett raised Daniel and me mostly on her own after our father left when I was 9, and Daniel was 12. She worked as a claims adjuster for 31 years, put both of us through state college without loans, and never remarried, though she dated occasionally and always laughed off our teenage attempts to play matchmaker. She was not a woman who played favorites easily, at least, not in any way either of us noticed growing up. If anything, she'd bent over backward to treat Daniel and me exactly the same, down to matching birthday budgets and identical graduation gifts, as if she were terrified of ever being accused of loving one of us more. That changed subtly after her stroke. The stroke happened on a Sunday afternoon, 4 days after her 68th birthday. I found her myself on the kitchen floor of the Larkspur Lane house and called the ambulance. She survived, but the stroke left her with significant right-side weakness, slurred and limited speech, and periods of confusion that her doctors described as consistent with early vascular cognitive decline, not full dementia, not yet, but a marked change from the sharp, quick-witted woman she'd been before. I moved my work schedule around to manage her care. I'm a physical therapist, and my clinic manager, a woman named Renata, let me shift to a 4-day week so I could handle Mom's appointments, her medications, her physical therapy sessions twice a week. I did her grocery shopping. I sat with her during the worst of the confused episodes when she'd sometimes forget which decade she was in or ask me where our father was, forgetting he'd left 27 years earlier. Daniel lived 2 hours away in Seattle, working in commercial software sales. He called our mother regularly. I'll give him that, but the in-person visits were rare and always seemed to land on holidays or brief weekend stops that coincided with other trips. I don't say any of this to build myself up as some flawless, self-sacrificing daughter. I had my own resentments during those 18 months, nights I sat in my car outside her house, exhausted, wondering why the weight always seemed to land on me. I wasn't perfect about it. There were visits I rushed through, days I snapped at her when she repeated the same question for the 5th time. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters for what comes later. But I was there. Consistently, imperfectly, but there. And so when Daniel stood in that lawyer's office and told me our mother had wanted him to have everything, some part of me, a part I'm not proud of, briefly wondered if maybe I'd misunderstood the relationship the whole time. Maybe she and Daniel had a closeness I hadn't seen. Maybe, despite everything, I actually was the daughter she'd taken for granted, not the one she'd depended on. That doubt didn't last as long as it might have. But it was there, and it hurt more than almost anything else in this story. I asked Daniel, a few days after the will reading, to walk me through exactly when our mother had told him she wanted him to have everything. He said it had come up gradually over several conversations in the last year of her life. Nothing dramatic, just casual mentions during phone calls about wanting to keep the house in the family, and knowing Daniel was the one who'd always talked about someday raising his own kids there, the way we'd been raised. It was, I'll admit, a story with some believable texture. Daniel had talked about the house that way occasionally over the years, a wistful, someday kind of comment, the sort people make about childhood homes without necessarily meaning anything concrete by it. He also told me our mother had specifically asked him to handle updating her will about a year before she died, after her stroke, because she didn't want to burden me with the paperwork on top of everything else I was already doing for her. He said he'd driven down from Seattle 3 separate times that year to help her meet with Arthur Michaels and finalize everything. I asked why she hadn't mentioned any of this to me directly, given that I was the one who saw her 3 or 4 times a week. Daniel's answer was gentle, almost sympathetic. I think she didn't want to make it weird between us, Grace. I think she knew it might hurt your feelings and she didn't want that conversation weighing on you while you were already doing so much. It was, again, a plausible answer. Painful, but plausible. I left that conversation not fully believing him, but not having any concrete reason to disbelieve him either, just a persistent, low hum of wrongness I couldn't yet justify. That wrongness didn't have a name until I found the note. 6 weeks after the funeral, I finally worked up the emotional strength to go through the boxes of our mother's belongings that Daniel hadn't wanted, mostly kitchen items, old photo albums, a shelf of recipe books she'd collected over decades. I was flipping through her oldest recipe book, a spiral-bound collection of family recipes she'd assembled by hand in the early 90s, when a folded piece of paper slipped out from the inside back cover. It was a single sheet, in our mother's handwriting I would recognize anywhere, looping and slightly slanted, the same hand that had signed every school permission slip and birthday card of my childhood. It was dated 8 months before she died, 4 months after the will Daniel claimed she'd updated with his help. The note read, in full, "If anything happens to me, I want Grace to have the house. She's the one who's been here, who's given up so much of her own life to take care of me, and I never want her to feel like that went unnoticed. Daniel has always been able to take care of himself. I love them both the same, but Grace has earned this, and I need someone to know that in case things don't go the way I plan." I read it 4 times before I could fully process what I was looking at. It wasn't a legal document. It had no notary stamp, no witness signature, nothing that would hold up as an official amendment to a will on its own. But it was dated 8 months before her death, 4 months after the will Daniel claimed she'd helped him finalize, and it directly contradicted everything he'd told the entire family. I sat on the floor of my mother's empty living room and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral itself. I didn't go to Daniel first. I went to Arthur Michaels, the estate attorney, with the note in hand. Arthur read it carefully twice and told me something that reframed the entire situation for me. The will Daniel had described, the one supposedly finalized with our mother's clear, considered input a year before her death, had actually been amended just 5 months before she died, not a year. The original will, executed 3 years earlier when our mother was still fully independent and cognitively sharp, had split the estate evenly between Daniel and me, with the house specifically designated to be sold and the proceeds divided. The amended version, the one naming Daniel sole beneficiary of the house and remaining accounts, had been signed 5 months before her death. By that point, our mother was 14 months post-stroke. In the period her neurologist, Dr. Patricia Nomura, had specifically flagged during a cognitive assessment as showing mild but measurable decline in executive function and short-term recall. According to medical records I later requested with Arthur's help. I asked Arthur how an amendment like that gets legally finalized if there are concerns about cognitive capacity. He explained that Daniel, as the family member present for the signing, had brought a different notary than the one who'd handled the original will, someone Arthur didn't recognize, from an office 2 towns over from where our mother lived. That detail, the different notary, became the thread I started pulling. I requested the full notarization file from the county records office, which took about 3 weeks to process. When it finally arrived, I found the notary's name. A woman named Carol Ashby, operating out of a small Taxan notary storefront in Bridgeton, roughly 40 minutes from our mother's house. The same town where Daniel had grown up going to a dentist he still, oddly, kept using even after moving to Seattle. I called Carol Ashby directly, and to my surprise she was willing to talk. She remembered the signing, she said, because it was unusual. Daniel had brought our mother and himself alone, and had stayed in the room for the entire signing, which she said wasn't typical procedure but also wasn't explicitly against the rules for a notarization, especially since our mother was mobility impaired and needed some physical assistance getting into the office. I asked Carol if she'd had any concerns at the time about our mother's capacity to understand what she was signing. She paused before answering, then said something that confirmed what I'd started to suspect. Honestly, looking back, I probably should have asked more questions. She seemed a little unsure of some details when I asked her routine confirmation questions, the date mostly. Her son answered for her a couple of times when she hesitated. I noted it wasn't unusual for elderly clients to need prompting, so I didn't flag it as anything more than that at the time. Her son answered for her. That detail, small as it sounds, mattered enormously. A notary's job in a moment like that is to confirm the person signing understands what they're doing of their own independent will. If Daniel was answering for her, even innocently, even out of habit, it undermined the entire basis of independent understanding the amendment relied on. I brought this information back to Arthur along with the handwritten note and asked him directly, did I have grounds to contest the will? He told me I did, not a guarantee of success, but real, legitimate grounds based on the timing relative to the cognitive assessment, the irregular notarization circumstances, and the existence of a contradicting handwritten document in our mother's own hand, dated after the amended will was signed. I called Daniel and told him I'd found the note and that I'd spoken with Carol Ashby. There was a long silence on the phone before he spoke. When he did, his voice had lost the gentle, patient quality it had carried in Arthur's office weeks earlier. You're going to drag Mom's memory through a courtroom over a house, he said. Is that really what you want to do, Grace? Is that really how you want to honor her? I told him I wanted to honor her by making sure her actual wishes were respected, not the version he'd decided to present to the family, and to Arthur, and apparently to a notary who let him answer questions on our mother's behalf. He tried, at that point, a different explanation, one I hadn't heard yet. He said our mother's decision hadn't been about favoritism at all, it had been strategic. He said she'd told him, during one of his visits, that she was worried about my finances, worried that if the house went to both of us jointly, I'd feel pressured to sell it quickly for the cash, when what she really wanted was for someone in the family to keep it long-term. And Daniel, with his higher income from his sales job, was in a better position to maintain it without needing to liquidate it. I asked him if that were true, why the handwritten note dated after the will amendment said the exact opposite, why it specifically named me as the one who'd earned the house. He didn't have an answer for that. He said finally, quietly, maybe she changed her mind again. People do that. You don't know what was in her head at the very end, Grace, any more than I do. That was, in its own way, true. And it was also, I realized, the exact ambiguity he was counting on to make this entire situation permanently unresolvable, a matter of dueling interpretations rather than documented fact. Except it wasn't fully ambiguous. Not once you accounted for the timeline, the cognitive assessment, and the irregular notarization together. Over the following month, with Arthur's help, I put together the complete sequence of events laid out plainly, the way I eventually presented it in mediation. 3 years before her death, our mother, cognitively sharp, fully independent, created a will splitting the estate evenly between Daniel and me. 14 months after her stroke, her neurologist documented measurable decline in executive function and short-term recall during a formal cognitive assessment. 5 months before her death, 9 months after that documented decline, Daniel drove her to an unfamiliar notary in a different town, stayed in the room throughout the signing, and answered on her behalf when she hesitated on basic confirmation questions, resulting in an amended will naming him sole beneficiary of the house and remaining investment accounts. 4 months after that signing, 8 months before her death, our mother wrote in her own hand a note stating clearly and specifically that she wanted me to have the house because of the care I'd provided, directly contradicting the amendment Daniel had arranged. I don't know, and will probably never know with full certainty, exactly what conversations happened in that car on the way to Bridgeton, or in that notary's office, or whether our mother, in a moment of confusion or exhaustion or simple desire to avoid conflict, went along with something she didn't fully understand or perhaps didn't fully want. What I do know is that the handwritten note, written afterward, in a moment of clarity, unprompted by anyone, tucked away where she perhaps intended someone to find it eventually, represented the clearest, most independent expression of her actual wishes that existed anywhere in this entire story. Daniel, when presented with the full timeline during mediation, didn't offer another explanation. He sat quietly for a long time, and then he said something I think was, in its own way, close to the truth of his own experience of all this. I told myself she wanted this. I think some part of me needed her to have wanted it because I knew how it would look otherwise. I want to be honest with you about how this resolved, because it wasn't a courtroom victory with a gavel coming down in my favor. It was messier and slower than that, the way these things almost always are in real life. We went through 11 weeks of formal mediation rather than a full will contest in probate court, largely on Arthur's advice. A contested will case, he told me, could take over a year, cost both of us tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and offered no guarantee of a cleaner outcome than what a structured mediation might produce more quickly. The mediated agreement, finalized 5 months after I found the note, restored the house to my sole ownership, consistent with what the handwritten note described, while allowing Daniel to retain the investment accounts, which after estate taxes amounted to roughly $185,000, less than the value of the house, but a meaningful sum, and one that acknowledged some version of shared inheritance rather than an all-or-nothing outcome for either of us. I want to be clear that this wasn't purely a punitive resolution designed to strip Daniel of everything. Even with everything I'd learned, I didn't want that. I wanted the truth acknowledged and the actual documented wishes honored, not total victory dressed up as justice. Daniel didn't contest the mediated outcome, though our relationship in the aftermath became something neither of us has fully figured out how to repair. We talk, occasionally, mostly around logistics, closing out our mother's remaining accounts, splitting a small storage unit of her belongings neither of us had gotten to yet. It's careful, it's not warm. I moved into the Larkspur Lane house 8 months after the funeral, once the mediation was finalized. It took me a long time to be able to walk into that kitchen without seeing her on the floor the day of her stroke, or without hearing in my head the sound of her voice mouthing sorry over and over during those 18 months of care I gave her imperfectly, but completely. I found the recipe book again, a few weeks after moving in, the same one where I'd found the note, and I made her lasagna recipe from it for the first time since she'd died. I don't know why that particular act felt important, but it did. It felt like a way of saying, I heard you, I found what you left for me, it mattered. I think about Daniel sometimes, and I try to hold the same complicated understanding for him that I eventually found for our mother. That fear does strange things to people, that watching a sibling get more time, more visible closeness with a parent, even when that closeness came at real personal cost, can curdle into a resentment people don't always recognize in themselves until it's already shaped a decision they can't take back. That doesn't make what he did acceptable. It just makes it human, in the same complicated way most of the worst things people do to their families usually are. People have asked me since all this happened whether I regret finding the note, whether it would have been easier in some ways to have simply accepted Daniel's version of events and let the inheritance go without a fight, preserved whatever relationship we might have salvaged by not pulling on that thread. I don't think I would have been able to live with that, honestly. Not because of the house itself, though the house matters and I won't pretend otherwise, but because of what it would have meant to let a version of my mother exist in the world that wasn't true. A version where the daughter who drove out 4 times a week for 18 months was quietly, deliberately overlooked, and where nobody ever knew that wasn't what she actually wanted. The note mattered because it gave her back her own voice in a story that had almost been written entirely by someone else. I still keep that note. It's framed now, small and unassuming, on a shelf in what used to be my mother's study and is now mine. Not as a trophy, not as evidence of some battle I won, but as a reminder of something simpler. That she saw me, even in the middle of her hardest, most confused final years. That some part of her, clear enough in that moment to pick up a pen, wanted to make sure I knew that, no matter what happened afterward. I don't know if Daniel and I will ever fully repair what broke between us. Some days I think we will, slowly, the way families sometimes do after enough time passes. Other days I think we've simply become 2 people who share a mother's memory and very little else. What I do know is that I stopped needing his version of events to be true in order to feel at peace with my own. That, more than the house, more than the money, is what I actually walked away with.